She shed her diamonds like the cold scales of a past life. When a castle becomes a cage and a name becomes a sentence, the only path to oneself lies through the abyss. Can the dragon find the one who finally chose freedom? Our story begins. The silence of Malfoy Manor was not the peaceful quiet of a library. It was a heavy, predatory thing that seemed to swallow the sound of Hermione's breathing. She stood before the floor-to-length mirror in the master suite, the silk of her emerald robes feeling less like a garment and more like a gilded cage. For 3 years she had walked these halls. For 3 years she had been Mrs. Malfoy. And for 3 years she had felt the slow, agonizing erosion of the girl who had once outsmarted a Dark Lord. She reached up, her fingers trembling as they brushed the heavy diamond necklace coiled around her throat. It was a Malfoy heirloom, ancient, cold, and suffocating. To the wizarding world, she was the golden bridge between traditions, the war heroine who had tamed the dragon. But tonight, as the distant sounds of a gala echoed from the ballroom below, Hermione looked at her reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The eyes were tired. The spark of the Gryffindor lioness had been replaced by the practiced hollow poise of a pure-blood mistress. I cannot do this for another day, she thought, and the realization hit her with the force of a stupefy spell. If I stay, there will be nothing left of me to love. The door clicked open. Draco stood there, a vision of sharp lines and monochromatic perfection in his black tuxedo. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, his silver eyes softened, a momentary lapse in his aristocratic armor. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, an approach that usually made her heart skip. "You look breathtaking, Hermione," he murmured, his voice low and rich. "The guests are asking for you. Mother is already making excuses, but I told her you were simply ensuring everything was perfect. You always do." Warmth flared in her chest, a dangerous, seductive heat. She wanted to lean into him, to tell him she was drowning and ask him to pull her up. But then his hand dropped, and he adjusted his cuffs, his gaze shifting to her jewelry. "The necklace is slightly crooked," he said, his tone shifting back to the cool, clinical focus of a man who managed a dynasty. "Fix it. We have a standard to maintain tonight, especially with the ministry officials present. You know how important this evening is for the family's reputation." The warmth died instantly, replaced by a bitter, biting frost. The family's reputation. Not her. Never just her. "Of course," she said, her voice sounding like it came from a great distance. "The standard. I'll be down in a moment, Draco." "Don't be long," he replied, giving her a sharp, brief nod before turning on his heel and exiting. The rejection stung more than it should have after all this time. He didn't see the glassiness in her eyes. He saw a misplaced accessory. As the door closed, Hermione didn't fix the necklace. She unlatched it, letting the diamonds hit the velvet vanity with a muffled thud. Beside it, she slid off her wedding ring, the heavy platinum band that felt like a shackle. She didn't pack a trunk. She didn't write a long, tear-stained letter. She took only her wand, a small beaded bag she had kept hidden in the back of the wardrobe, and the Muggle passport she'd renewed in secret months ago. She bypassed the main staircase, moving through the servant passages she had mapped out during her first lonely year in the house. The air grew colder as she reached the side postern gate. She didn't look back at the towering spires of the manor. She couldn't. If she saw the light in the ballroom window, she might lose her nerve. With a soft crack that was lost in the wind, she apparated to the outskirts of London. The transition from the magic-heavy atmosphere of Wiltshire to the gasoline-scented, neon-lit reality of the Muggle world was jarring. Hermione stood on a street corner in Victoria, shivering in her thin robes, until she managed to pull a plain trench coat from her bag. She walked until her feet ached, eventually finding a small, nondescript hotel. Inside the cramped room, the wallpaper was peeling and the heater hissed, but it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. There were no portraits to judge her. There was no Malfoy lineage etched into the silver. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. The repulsion she felt toward her life at the manor was absolute. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the betrayal of her own heart began to seep in. She had left him. She had left the man who had sat by her bed when she had dragonpox, the man who had defended her against his own aunt's ghost. "But he doesn't love Hermione Granger," she whispered to the empty room. "He loves the idea of a redeemed Malfoy name, and I can't be his penance anymore." Back at the manor, the gala was in full swing. Draco moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but his eyes constantly flickered to the entrance. 5 minutes became 20. 20 became an hour. The doubt began as a small, cold knot in his stomach. Hermione was never late. She was precise. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the cold cynicism of his father's world. He excused himself from a conversation with the minister, his pace quickening as he climbed the stairs. He burst into their suite, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Hermione, enough of this. He stopped. The room was empty, the air still. His eyes fell on the vanity. The emerald robes were crumpled on the floor like a shed skin. The diamonds lay abandoned. And there, reflecting the moonlight, was her wedding ring. Draco felt as though the floor had vanished beneath him. He picked up the ring, the metal cold against his palm. There was no note, only the silence. "Where did you go?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Where could you possibly go where I won't find you?" He looked at the ring, and for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy felt true, unadulterated terror. He had spent years building a world for her, a fortress to keep her safe and elevated. He had given her everything the Malfoy name could buy. But as he stood in the middle of their hollowed-out sanctuary, he realized with a sickening jolt that he had forgotten to give her the one thing she actually needed: a reason to stay. He didn't call the auras. He didn't alert the staff. If word got out that the brightest witch of her age had fled the Malfoy castle, the scandal would be secondary to his own ruin. He closed his eyes, forcing his mind into the cold, disciplined channels of occlumency, trying to find the thread of their connection. But there was nothing. She had closed herself off. The seesaw of his emotions swung violently from rage to despair. How dare she? Followed immediately by, what have I done? He began to pace, his mind racing through every conversation they'd had in the last month. Every time she had gone quiet, every time he had corrected her form or her tone. He realized with a soul-crushing clarity that he had been treating her like a prized acquisition rather than a partner. He had been so afraid of losing his status that he had sacrificed his wife to maintain it. Hermione, meanwhile, was miles away, staring out a train window as the English countryside blurred into a grey smudge. She was headed north toward a small coastal town where the Grangers had taken her once as a child. A place where magic was just a story and Malfoys didn't exist. She touched her bare ring finger, the skin feeling strangely raw. She wondered if he was angry. She wondered if he was even worried, or if he was simply embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Draco," she whispered against the glass. "But I have to find out if there's anything left of the girl who lived in the cupboard under the stairs before she became a monument in your hall." The build-up of tension was just beginning. Draco wouldn't sit and wait. He was a Malfoy, he was a hunter, and Hermione, despite her fear, was a lioness. The game of cat and mouse had begun, but in this story, the hunter didn't realize that his prey was the only thing keeping him alive. As the train pulled into the station at dawn, Hermione stepped onto the platform. The air was thick with salt and the cries of seagulls. She took a deep breath, the first real breath she'd taken in years. "I'm free," she told herself. But even as she said it, a part of her, the part that still smelled of sandalwood and expensive parchment, ached with a phantom cold. The trust she had once placed in him was shattered, but the warmth of his memory was a fire she couldn't quite extinguish. She began to walk toward the sea, unaware that back in Wiltshire, Draco was already standing in their dark room, holding her ring to his lips, his eyes burning with a dark, desperate resolve. He would find her, and when he did, he would either bring her home or burn the castle down with both of them inside. The coastal town of Broadstairs was a smudge of salt crust and faded Victorian charm, a world away from the oppressive grandeur of Malfoy Manor. Hermione had checked into a small bed and breakfast under the name Jean Wilkins. Her room was tiny, smelling of lavender sachets and old wood, with a window that looked out over the churning grey expanse of the North Sea. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but sleep and walk the shoreline until her lungs burned with the cold Atlantic air. The repulsion she felt toward her old life was still there, a sharp, jagged thing in her chest, but it was beginning to be accompanied by a hollow, terrifying void. In the silence of the Muggle world, she realized how much of her identity had become intertwined with being Draco's shadow. At the manor, every movement was choreographed. Here, the lack of structure was paralyzing. She sat on a jagged rock, her Muggle genes damp from the spray. She thought of Draco's face when he'd looked at her in the mirror. That flash of softness. Was it real, or had she imagined it to survive? The warmth of his memory tried to crawl back in, reminding her of the way he looked when he was engrossed in an ancient manuscript, his hair falling over his forehead, his guard completely down. But then the cold would follow, the memory of him turning away to greet a dignitary, his voice dropping into that smooth, unreachable baritone that signaled he was no longer hers, but the world's. "He won't come," she told herself, tossing a pebble into the surf. "He's too proud. A missing wife is a scandal. A wife who ran away to a seaside B&B is a humiliation he won't acknowledge." But she was wrong. Back in the wizarding world, Draco Malfoy was unraveling with a precision that was terrifying to behold. He had spent 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused mania. He had used every contact, every dark market tracking spell, and every ounce of logic he possessed. He knew Hermione better than she knew herself. He knew she wouldn't go to Harry or Ron. She was too proud to admit her marriage was a gilded failure. She wouldn't go to a magical hotel. She would go somewhere quiet, somewhere muggle, somewhere that reminded her of a time before the war had turned her into a symbol. He found the lead through a stray memory, a conversation from their second year of marriage. She had mentioned a summer trip to Kent, a place with white cliffs and too much wind. When Draco arrived in Broadstairs, he didn't look like the wizard who had stood in the ballroom. He wore a heavy wool coat, his hair wind-blown, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He didn't use magic to find her. He walked the streets showing a photograph, an enchanted one he had frozen so it looked like a standard muggle snapshot, to shopkeepers. The approach happened on the third afternoon. Hermione was coming out of a small bakery, a paper bag of scones in her hand, when she saw him. He was standing across the narrow street, framed by the peeling paint of a fish and chip shop. The sight of him was a physical blow to her stomach. He looked out of place, a silver blade in a wooden room, yet he looked more human than she had seen him in years. Her first instinct was to run. The repulsion flared. She turned toward the alleyway, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Hermione!" His voice didn't have the cold command of the manor. It was raw, stripped of its polish. She froze. The trust she once had in him flickered like a dying candle. Could she trust him not to drag her back? Could she trust that he wasn't just here to protect the Malfoy name? She turned slowly. Draco was crossing the street, his hands held out as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "Don't!" she snapped, her voice trembling. "If you've brought a port key, Draco, I swear I'll hex you into next week." He stopped 5 feet away. The tension between them was a living thing, an invisible wire pulled taut. "I didn't bring a port key. I didn't even bring my wand out of its holster." "Then why are you here?" she demanded, her eyes stinging with sudden, unwanted tears. "Go back to your gala. Go back to your standards. I'm sure your mother has found a suitable excuse for my absence by now. Tell them I have the flu. Tell them I've gone mad. It isn't far from the truth." "I don't care about the gala," Draco said, and for the first time she believed him. The betrayal she felt, the sense that he had chosen his legacy over her, wavered as she looked at the dark circles under his eyes. "I don't care about the ministry, or the name, or the damn standard. The house is silent, Hermione. It's not just quiet. It's dead. I can't breathe in there without you." "You did just fine for 3 years," she shot back, the repulsion gaining strength from her anger. "You didn't need me to breathe. You needed me to stand 2 paces behind you and look dignified. You needed a trophy that the ministry couldn't criticize. Well, look at me, Draco. I'm covered in salt, I'm wearing second-hand clothes, and I haven't brushed my hair in 2 days. The trophy is broken." "I never called you that," he hissed, his own temper sparking. "I protected you. I built those walls to keep the world away from you so you wouldn't have to fight anymore. You built them so high you forgot I was inside," she screamed, the sound echoing off the narrow brick walls. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Draco flinched as if she'd struck him. The cold between them was absolute in that moment, a crystalline barrier of misunderstanding. "I thought," he started, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought if I made everything perfect, you would finally feel like you belonged there. I thought if I acted the part of the perfect husband, you would forget that I was the boy who let Death Eaters into your school. I was trying to earn you, Hermione." The doubt in Hermione's mind shifted. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, trying to use the only tools he had, wealth, status, and control, to keep the one good thing in his life. But those tools were the very things that were killing her. "You can't earn a person, Draco," she said softly, the warmth beginning to seep back in, though it was tinged with sadness. "You can only be with them, and I wasn't with you at the manor. I was an ornament." He stepped closer, just one small step. "Then don't come back to the manor. Not yet. Stay here, or go somewhere else. But let me stay near you. Just near." "No," she said, and watched his face crumble. "If you stay because you're afraid of losing me, nothing changes. You'll just be managing me in a different location." "Then what do you want?" he asked, a note of desperation creeping in. "Tell me, and I'll do it. I'll renounce the title. I'll sell the estate. "I want you to go home," she interrupted. "I need time to remember who Hermione Granger is, and you need to figure out who Draco is when he isn't playing the part of the great restorer of the Malfoy line." The repulsion was gone, replaced by a weary distance. She turned and began to walk away, her heart aching with every step. "Hermione!" he called out. She didn't stop. "I'm not leaving this town," he yelled after her. "I'll be at the hotel by the pier. Every day at noon, I'll be sitting at that cafe on the corner. You don't have to talk to me. You don't even have to look at me. But I'm not going back to a world without you in it." She reached the door of her B&B and went inside without looking back. She collapsed against the door, clutching the bag of scones to her chest, sobbing silently. The seesaw had swung again. She had pushed him away, but the trust, the tiny, fragile hope that he might actually change, had finally taken root. Upstairs, she sat by the window. At noon the next day, she looked out. Through a pair of muggle binoculars she'd bought, she saw him. He was sitting at a small metal table, a cup of tea untouched in front of him, staring out at the sea. He looked cold. He looked miserable. He looked like the man she loved. But she didn't go down. The conflict wasn't resolved. It was merely ripening. The tension between her need for autonomy and her love for him was a slow-burn agony. She spent the week watching him from afar, seeing him struggle with mundane muggle tasks, trying to figure out a vending machine, getting frustrated with a map, shrinking into himself when the wind grew too harsh. By the end of the week, the warmth was winning. She saw him help an elderly woman carry her groceries. She saw him sit on the beach and just exist, without the mask of the Malfoy air. On the 7th day, it rained, a torrential, freezing downpour. Hermione watched Draco sit at his usual table. He didn't have an umbrella. He sat there, soaking wet, shivering, his eyes fixed on the door of her B&B. The approach was inevitable. She grabbed her coat and ran down the stairs. She burst out of the door and sprinted across the street, her shoes splashing in the puddles. She reached the cafe and stood over him, breathless. "You're an idiot," she hissed, water dripping from her hair. You're going to get pneumonia." Draco looked up, his face pale and wet, a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You came down." "Only because I don't want your death on my conscience," she lied, the trust finally outweighing the doubt. "I'll take it," he whispered. She looked at him, the tension between them reaching a breaking point. The seesaw was poised for a shift. She reached out, her hand hovering near his face, before she pulled back. Not yet. The cold hadn't fully melted, and the betrayal of those 3 years still whispered in her ear. "Come inside," she said. "We need to talk, truly talk." As they walked back to the B&B, Draco a step behind her, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of the manor. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a beginning. The internal monologue in Hermione's head was a whirlwind. Am I making a mistake? Can he really change? Does he even know how? And in Draco's mind, a single repeated mantra. Don't lose her again. Don't let the mask slip back on. Just be Draco. Just be hers. The stage was set for the middle of their journey. The messy, painful process of deconstructing a marriage built on ghosts to find the living people underneath. The emotional hook was set, and the tension was a wire humming in the wind. The resolution was miles away, but for the first time they were walking in the same direction. The small room at the bed and breakfast felt even smaller with Draco standing in the center of it. He was dripping wet, his expensive wool coat darkened by the rain, and he looked entirely out of place against the floral wallpaper and the cheap pine furniture. Hermione stood by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching him. The approach had been made, but the repulsion was still hovering just beneath the surface, a defensive reflex born of 3 years of emotional neglect. "Take off the coat, Draco. You're shivering," she said, her voice clipped. It was a command, not a suggestion, a flicker of the old Hermione who bossed people around in the Gryffindor common room. He obeyed without a word, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. As he laid the heavy garment over a chair, she saw the fine tremor in his hands. This was the betrayal of his physical composure. The Malfoy who never stumbled, who never showed weakness, was crumbling in a seaside town over a cup of lukewarm tea, and a woman who had finally found the strength to say no. "I have some dry towels in the bathroom," she murmured, turning away to hide the warmth that was beginning to soften her expression. She couldn't let him see it yet. If she let him in too quickly, the cycle would simply reset. The seesaw needed to stay in the air. When she returned, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, the only furniture in the room besides a single wooden chair. He looked up at her, and the trust she saw in his eyes was almost painful. It was the trust of someone who had surrendered completely, who had stopped fighting for the crown and started fighting for the heart. "Why Broadstairs, Hermione?" he asked softly, taking the towel from her. "Out of all the places in the world, why come here to disappear?" "Because it's ordinary," she replied, leaning against the vanity. "Because in this town nobody cares about the Battle of Hogwarts or the Malfoy Vault. I'm just a girl in a trench coat. I needed to remember what that felt like before I forgot entirely." "You could never be ordinary," he countered, his voice gaining a trace of its old intensity. "To you, maybe," she shot back, the cold returning to her tone. "To you, I was a project, a way to prove that the Malfoys were reformed. Look at us. We've married a muggle-born. We're modern. We're progressive. Do you have any idea how much it hurt to realize I was your social shield? Draco flinched, the repulsion of her words hitting him squarely. That's not fair. I loved you long before the politics of our marriage became a factor. Did you? She challenged, stepping closer, the tense dialogue beginning to heat the room. Then why did you stop talking to me? Why did every conversation become about the guest list or the decor? Why did you look at me like I was a smudge on the silver every time I mentioned my parents or my life before the war? Because I was ashamed, Draco shouted, standing up. The sudden movement made the small room feel claustrophobic. Not of you, never of you. I was ashamed of them. I was ashamed of the world I was trying to force you into. I thought if I could make you the perfect mistress of the manor, if I could make you fit perfectly into that world, then maybe I wouldn't have to face the fact that I was dragging you into a graveyard. The doubt in Hermione's mind flared. Was this a new mask? A clever psychological shift to gain her sympathy? She watched him closely, her internal monologue a chaotic mess of believe him and protect yourself. You were so focused on the graveyard that you buried me alive with you, she whispered. Draco stepped toward her, and for a moment the warmth was overwhelming. He reached out, his hand stopping just inches from her cheek. He was waiting for permission, a radical departure from the man who used to dictate her schedule down to the minute. I didn't know how to be a husband, Hermione, he admitted, his voice breaking. I only knew how to be a Malfoy, and Malfoys protect their assets. They secure their borders. I treated our marriage like a campaign because I was terrified that if I let my guard down, if I let the world see how much I actually needed you, someone would find a way to take you away from me. So you took me away from myself instead, she said, but the bite was gone from her voice. The approach was winning. She leaned her face into his hand, the contact of his skin against hers sending a jolt through her that she hadn't felt in years. He closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him. For a long minute, they just stood there, the only sound the rain drumming against the window and the distant roar of the sea. It was a moment of trust, fragile and thin as glass, but it was there. But then, as always, the repulsion returned. Hermione pulled back, her eyes hardening. 1 week of sitting in the rain doesn't fix 3 years of silence, Draco. You say you want to change, but you don't even know what that means. You're still here in your expensive shoes, waiting for me to cave so we can go back to the status quo. I told you, I'm not going back, he said firmly. Then prove it, she challenged. Stay here, not in the hotel by the pier with the silk sheets and the room service. Stay in the real world. No magic, no house elves, no galleons. If you want to know who I am, you have to live in my world for a while. The cold challenge hung in the air. For Draco, this was the ultimate betrayal of his upbringing. To live without magic was to be naked. To live without his wealth was to be invisible. He looked around the tiny, cramped room, then back at her determined face. Fine, he said. If that's what it takes to make you believe me, I'll stay. I'll stay until you tell me to leave, or until I've earned the right to ask you to come home. Don't use that word again, she warned. Earned. This isn't a transaction, Draco. It's a relationship, or it's nothing. The shift in his attitude was visible. The tension in his shoulders dropped, replaced by a grim, quiet resolve. He wasn't the prince of the manor anymore. He was a man in a wet shirt in a cheap B&B. And for the first time since she had met him on the Hogwarts Express, Hermione felt like she was seeing the real Draco Malfoy. The gradual build-up of tension moved into a new phase. Over the next few days, the emotional seesaw became their daily rhythm. There was the warmth of their first morning together when she taught him how to use a muggle kettle. He watched her with an intensity that made her hands shake, his eyes following every movement as if she were performing a complex piece of alchemy. "It's just boiling water, Draco," she laughed, a genuine sound that startled both of them. "It's more than that," he murmured, his gaze shifting to her lips. "It's you, just you, doing something for the sake of it, not because there's a gala to attend." But that warmth was followed by the cold of the afternoon, when the reality of their situation set in. Draco struggled with the lack of privacy, the noise of the street, and the sheer slowness of Muggle life. He became irritable, snapping at her when he couldn't find a way to dry his clothes without a spell. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, pacing the small room like a caged beast. "We are wasting time, Hermione. We could be in Paris, or the Maldives, or anywhere that isn't this damp little box." "And there it is," she said, her voice dripping with betrayal. "The Malfoy comes out. You don't want me, Draco. You want comfort. You want the world to bend to your will. Well, the Muggle world doesn't care who your father is." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," she shouted back, the intensified conflict making the air vibrate. "You're bored. You're bored of me when I'm not wrapped in silk and sitting at the head of a table." "I am never bored of you," he roared, stepping into her space, his face inches from hers. "I am frustrated because I can't give you the things you deserve. I see you in this room, and I feel like a failure." "I don't want things, Draco. I want you." The tense dialogue broke into a heavy silence. They were both breathing hard, the space between them charged with a raw electric energy. The approach was so close now, the warmth so intense, that it felt like they might both catch fire. Draco reached out, his hands grasping her waist, pulling her flush against him. It was a repulsion turned into a desperate attraction. For a second, Hermione fought it, her hands pushing against his chest, her doubt screaming that this was just another way for him to take control. But then she looked into his eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to hold on to the only anchor he had left in a world that had stopped making sense. She stopped pushing. Her hands slid up his chest, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart, and rested on his shoulders. The warmth flooded back, drowning out the cold of the rain and the bitterness of the past 3 years. "You're so stubborn," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you're impossible," he replied, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. They didn't kiss. Not yet. The slow burn required more than just an argument and a moment of clarity. The betrayal of their past still stood between them like a ghost, and the trust was still a flickering flame that needed to be shielded. But the shift had happened. The conflict was no longer about the manor or the Malfoy name. It was about the two people standing in a small room in Broadstairs, trying to figure out if they were brave enough to be happy. "Stay," she whispered. "Always," he promised. As the sun began to break through the clouds outside, casting long, pale streaks of light across the floral carpet, Hermione felt the first real spark of hope. The beginning was over. The middle, the hard, beautiful, painful middle, had truly begun. They were no longer running away. They were finally, painfully, starting to run toward each other. The emotional dynamics had shifted from a battle of wills to a battle for survival. Every internal monologue in Hermione's head was now focused on one thing. Can we be enough for each other? And as Draco held her in the quiet of the morning, he knew the answer. He would make sure of it, even if he had to learn how to boil every kettle in England to prove it. The tension was still there, the seesaw still ready to tip. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight was balanced. The following week in Broadstairs was a masterclass in friction. If the first few days had been a dramatic collision, the days that followed were a slow, grinding realization of how different their worlds truly were. The emotional seesaw no longer swung with the violence of a storm. Instead, it tilted with the subtle, agonizing precision of two people trying to share a single heartbeat while living in different dimensions. The approach came in the quiet moments of the morning. Draco had taken her challenge to heart with a grim, silent intensity that was almost frightening. He had stopped wearing his tailored suits, opting instead for a thick navy blue jumper he'd bought at a local shop. It was slightly too large for him, making him look younger, softer, and more vulnerable. He spent hours trying to master the manual nature of their existence. One afternoon, Hermione returned to the B&B to find him sitting on the floor, surrounded by a pile of laundry. He was staring at the instructions on a bottle of Muggle detergent, as if it were a high-level alchemy text. "It says, 'Pour into the drawer, Hermione,'" he said, his voice tight with a mixture of frustration and genuine confusion. "But there are 3 drawers, and I've already spilled half of it on the carpet. Why do Muggles make everything so unnecessarily complicated? A simple scouring charm would have this done in 3 seconds." The warmth bubbled up in her chest. She sat down on the floor beside him, her shoulder brushing his. For a moment, the trust was there. A shared domesticity that felt more real than any gala they had ever attended. "Because the effort makes the result mean something, Draco," she said softly, taking the bottle from him. "When you use magic, you're bypassing the process. Here, you have to engage with the world. You have to care enough to figure out which drawer is for the softener." He looked at her, his silver eyes searching hers. "I am trying to care, Hermione. I'm trying to care about the drawers and the kettles and the damp air. But I'm mostly just trying to figure out how to make you look at me without that shadow in your eyes, that cold look you get whenever I mention home. Then stop calling it home," she whispered. "The manor was a house. This is life." The repulsion flared then, sudden and sharp. Draco stood up, his face hardening. "It's not life, Hermione. It's a temporary penance. You can't honestly tell me you want to spend the rest of your days in a 10 by 10 room smelling of old fish and damp wool. You're a genius. You're the brightest witch of our generation. You belong in a world where your mind is used, Not a world where you're proud of yourself for mastering a washing machine. The betrayal of his words stung. Hermione stood to face him, the intensified conflict making the small room feel like a pressure cooker. "There you go again," she snapped, "defining me by my utility, defining me by where I belong in your hierarchy. I don't belong anywhere, Draco. I am a person, not a historical monument. I'd rather be a nobody in this damp room than a somebody in a house where my presence is just a political statement. I never said you were just a statement. You didn't have to. Your silence said it every day for 3 years." They stood panting, the tense dialogue vibrating between them. The cold was back, a thick, icy wall that made the warmth of moments ago feel like a hallucination. Hermione felt the familiar urge to run, to put more miles between herself and the man who claimed to love her but couldn't seem to see her. But Draco didn't let her turn away this time. He grabbed her hand, not with the controlling grip of a husband, but with the desperate clutch of a drowning man. "Wait," he breathed. "Wait. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this, Hermione. I don't know how to talk about feelings without it sounding like an ultimatum. My father never... We didn't talk. We negotiated. We commanded. We survived." The doubt in her mind wavered. She saw the internal monologue playing out on his face, the struggle between the ingrained Malfoy arrogance and the raw, unformed man underneath. "I know you didn't have a map for this," she said, her voice softening as the warmth fought its way back. "But you have to stop trying to lead the way. You have to walk with me, Draco. Not in front of me, and certainly not behind me." He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a slow burn that had been simmering for weeks. "With you. Fine. Where are we walking?" "To the cliffs," she said. "The sun is actually out. Let's just walk." The walk to the North Foreland was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the manor. It was a gradual build-up of tension, an awareness of each other that felt brand new. As they climbed the grassy path, the wind whipped Hermione's hair across her face. Without thinking, Draco reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His touch lingered, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. She shivered, but not from the cold. The approach was almost unbearable now. Every time they touched, it felt like a promise and a threat all at once. "Hermione," he said, stopping near the edge of the chalk cliffs. The sea below was a brilliant, crashing turquoise. "When you left, when I found that ring on the vanity, I felt like my heart had been ripped out through my throat. I realized that I had spent 3 years trying to build a fortress for us, but I had built it with the wrong materials. I used stone and gold and blood. I should have just used the truth." "And what is the truth, Draco?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. He turned her to face him, his hands resting on her waist. The warmth was back, more intense than ever, a heat that seemed to radiate from his very soul. "The truth is that I am a coward," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was too afraid to tell you that I felt like I wasn't enough for you. I thought if I stopped being Draco the Redeemed and just became Draco, your husband, you'd realize you could do so much better. I was hiding behind the manor because I was afraid of what you'd see if the lights were too bright. The trust finally snapped into place. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. The betrayal she had felt wasn't just his. It was a mutual misunderstanding born of fear. She had been hiding too. Hiding her resentment, hiding her needs, hiding the girl she used to be because she thought she had to fit his world to keep him. "We were both hiding," she admitted, her hands moving up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. "But Draco, you can't build a life in the dark. You have to let the light in, even if it shows the dust." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The repulsion was a distant memory. The seesaw had finally leveled out. The tension was no longer a wire about to snap. It was a bridge. "I don't care about the dust," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "I just want the light. I just want you." They were so close. The slow burn was reaching its flashpoint. Hermione could see the individual flecks of grey in his eyes, the tiny scar on his lip from a childhood accident, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his pale skin. She wanted to kiss him, to drown out the past 3 years with a single definitive act of approach. But as she tilted her head back, the doubt gave one last dying kick. Is this enough? Can we really go back? "Not back," Draco whispered, as if he could hear her thoughts. "Never back. Forward. Somewhere else. Somewhere new." He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against hers in a ghost of a kiss. A warmth so potent it made her knees weak. It wasn't the kiss she had been expecting. It wasn't a demand or a conquest. It was a question. "Are you still with me?" Hermione didn't answer with words. She tightened her grip on his jumper, pulling him down, closing the final inch of space. The kiss was everything the last 3 years hadn't been. It was messy, it was desperate, and it was devastatingly honest. It tasted of salt and rain and the lingering bitterness of tea. But beneath it all, it tasted like trust. It was the resolution of the first major conflict of their new life. The acknowledgement that they were both broken, both flawed, and both desperately in love with the person the world didn't see. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their faces flushed with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. Draco didn't look away this time. He didn't mask his emotions. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability that made Hermione's heart ache. "I love you, Hermione Malfoy," he said. And for the first time, the name didn't sound like a title. It sounded like a home. "And I love you, Draco," she replied. Just Draco. The emotional seesaw had found its center. The conflict of the mistress of the castle was resolved. Not because she had learned to fit the role, but because they had decided to throw the script away. As they walked back down the cliff path, hand in hand, the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. The gradual build-up of tension had led to this: a quiet coastal town, a damp B&B, and 2 people who had finally stopped running away from each other and started running together. They reached the door of the B&B, and Draco stopped, looking up at the faded sign. "We should probably figure out how to dry my coat," he said, a playful spark returning to his eyes. "Without magic." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed through the street. "I'll show you the radiator trick, but I'm warning you, it takes all night." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, pulling her into one last lingering kiss under the porch light. I have all the time in the world. The story had reached its end, but for Hermione and Draco, it was the perfect beginning. The questions that remained, where they would live, how they would face his family, what they would do with their lives, weren't burdens anymore. They were adventures. Because as long as they had the warmth, the trust, and each other, the castle was wherever they chose to stand. They walked inside, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving the ghosts of the past to be washed away by the tide. The resolution was complete. The development was absolute. They were no longer characters in a tragedy. They were the authors of their own messy, romantic, and perfectly imperfect love story. The morning after the cliffs felt like the first day of a new world, but the emotional seesaw was far from finished. While the previous evening had brought a breakthrough of trust, the light of day brought the cold reality of the doubt that still lingered in the corners of their shared history. Hermione woke to the sound of the radiator clanking, that muggle rhythm she had grown to find comforting, and the sight of Draco sitting by the window, staring at his hands. He wasn't wearing his mask of Malfoy arrogance, but he wasn't entirely at peace either. The approach of their kiss had bridged the physical gap, but the psychological novel of their relationship was entering a more complex chapter. "You're thinking about the manor," Hermione said softly, sitting up and pulling the duvet around her shoulders. Draco didn't look up immediately. "I'm thinking about the fact that I don't know how to exist without it. For 26 years, every choice I made was filtered through the lens of that house. What would the portraits think? What would the ancestors demand? Now, sitting in this room, I feel weightless, and it's terrifying." The warmth Hermione felt for his vulnerability was suddenly checked by a surge of repulsion. Weightless. To him, freedom felt like a lack of substance. To her, it was the only way to breathe. This was the intensified conflict that no amount of kissing could solve. They were fundamentally different in how they perceived belonging. "Weightless is good, Draco," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "It means you're not being crushed anymore. Why does that scare you?" "Because if I'm not a Malfoy of the Manor, who am I?" He finally turned to look at her, his silver eyes clouded. "To the world, I'm a redeemed Death Eater. To my mother, I'm the heir who disappeared. To you? What am I to you when we aren't fighting about my legacy?" "You're the man who stayed in the rain," she replied, though the internal monologue in her head was screaming with betrayal. Was he already looking for an exit? Was the allure of the castle starting to pull him back, now that the initial thrill of the chase was over? The tense dialogue hung between them. Draco stood and walked to the bed, sitting on the edge, mirroring their position from the day he arrived. But the energy was different. "I received a Patronus this morning," he admitted, his voice dropping. "From Mother. She's panicked. The Ministry is asking questions about your absence. They're starting to whisper about a scandal, or worse, that something happened to you." The cold flooded the room. Hermione felt the invisible walls of the Malfoy world closing in again, even here, 60 miles away. The betrayal felt fresh. Even in his moment of truth, the world he claimed to leave was still whispering in his ear. "And what did you tell her?" she asked, her heart hammering. I told her I found you, Draco said, reaching for her hand. She pulled it away. The repulsion was winning. I told her we were staying here. For now. For now? Hermione repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her. So, this is just a holiday, a catastrophic vacation from your real life. You're just waiting for me to get this independence out of my system so we can go back and fix the standard. That's not what I meant, and you know it, Draco snapped, the seesaw swinging violently back toward repulsion. I don't know it, Draco. I don't know anything except that the second your mother whistles, you start talking about scandals and ministry questions. You're still worried about the reputation of a house that almost destroyed us both. She scrambled out of bed, her movements frantic as she grabbed her trench coat. She needed air. She needed to be away from the scent of him, that expensive, lingering cedarwood that reminded her of the manor's library. "Where are you going?" he demanded, standing up. "Away from you," she cried. "You said you'd stay. You said you'd live in my world. But you're just a tourist here, Draco. You're waiting for the tour to end so you can go back to the palace." She slammed the door before he could respond. The gradual build-up of tension had peaked into a full-scale emotional retreat. Hermione ran down the stairs and out into the crisp morning air of Broadstairs. The sun was bright, mocking the grey turmoil in her chest. She walked toward the harbour, her mind a whirlwind of internal monologues. He can't change. It's in his blood. He'll always choose the name. He'll always choose the safety of the stone walls over the uncertainty of the open sea. But as she reached the pier, she stopped. She looked at the Muggle families, the fishermen, the ordinary life she had craved. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also lonely. She realized that she didn't just want to be Jan Wilkins. She wanted to be Hermione, the witch, the warrior, the woman who was loved for exactly who she was. And the only person who truly knew all those versions of her was the man she had just left shivering in a cheap B&B. The warmth tried to fight its way back, but the doubt was a heavy shield. She sat on a wooden bench watching the waves. An hour passed, then 2. I didn't answer her. The voice was quiet, coming from right behind her. Hermione didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of his step, the way his presence seemed to shift the very air around her. Draco came around the bench and sat down, leaving a careful distance between them, an approach tempered by respect. He wasn't wearing his coat. He was just in that blue jumper, his arms crossed against the biting sea wind. I didn't answer the part about coming home, he said, staring out at the horizon. I told her that if she wanted to see me, she would have to come here, to a Muggle cafe, without her wand, and that she would have to apologize to you, not to Mrs. Malfoy, to Hermione. Hermione turned to him, the trust flickering back to life, bright and searing. You told Narcissa Malfoy to come to a Muggle cafe. I did, Draco said, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. She'll probably faint, but I don't care. Because you were right, Hermione. I was a tourist. I was waiting for the standard to return. But this morning, when you slammed that door, I realized that I'd rather be weightless with you than grounded in a graveyard without you. The emotional seesaw found its level. The repulsion dissolved into a profound, aching warmth. Hermione reached across the gap between them, her fingers catching the hem of his sleeve. I'm sorry I ran, she whispered. I'm sorry I gave you a reason to, he replied. They sat in silence for a long time, the tension between them transforming into a quiet, solid trust. It wasn't the fiery passion of the cliffside. It was something more durable. It was the resolution of the psychological conflict that had plagued them since their wedding day. The realization that they didn't have to choose between their worlds. They just had to choose each other. She won't come, you know, Hermione said after a while, leaning her head against his shoulder. Your mother, she'll never sit in a muggle cafe. Then she won't see her son, Draco said firmly, and she won't see the woman who saved him. The slow burn of their reconnection was reaching a new depth. Draco turned his head, his lips brushing her temple. The contact was soft, a warmth that travelled straight to her core. What now? She asked. Now, Draco said, standing up and pulling her with him. We go back to that room. We figure out how to dry my coat without magic. And then we figure out where we're going to build our own castle. One with a lot more windows and no portraits of my great-uncle Lucius. Hermione laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The conflict was resolving. The development was clear. They were no longer the master and mistress of a hollow estate. They were two people standing on a pier, finally ready to start their life. As they walked back through the town, Draco tucked her hand into his pocket, his fingers intertwining with hers. The approach was constant now. Every step was a shared rhythm. When they reached the B&B, Draco stopped her at the bottom of the stairs. The hallway was dim, the air smelling of floor wax and sea salt. He turned her toward him, his hands sliding up to frame her face. The warmth was overwhelming. The trust was absolute. I'm never going back to that role, Hermione, he whispered, his eyes burning with a desperate, beautiful sincerity. I'm never going to let you feel like you're second to a name again. I know, she breathed. He leaned down, and this time the kiss was different. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a vow. It was long, slow, and deep, a warmth that seemed to erase every cold moment of the last 3 years. Hermione pulled him closer, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart finally, truly at rest. The seesaw had stopped swinging. They were balanced. In the quiet of the hallway, away from the eyes of the world and the shadows of the manor, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger finally found their happy ending. Not in a palace, but in each other. The resolution was complete. The story of Mrs. Malfoy was over. The story of Hermione and Draco was just beginning. They walked up the stairs, hand in hand, leaving the ghosts behind. The air was clear, the future was unwritten, and for the first time in their lives, they were both exactly where they belonged. The resolution to live weightless was a beautiful sentiment on a windswept pier, but the transition into a sustained middle ground proved to be an entirely different beast. For Hermione, the emotional seesaw now moved from the fear of being trapped to the fear of being the one who had broken Draco. She watched him in the days that followed their vow, looking for signs of the cold or the repulsion she expected to see as the novelty of their coastal exile wore thin. Instead of a collapse, she witnessed a transformation that was both touching and agonizingly slow. Draco had begun to treat their life in Broadstairs not as a penance, but as a project. the first one he had ever undertaken without a predefined Malfoy blueprint. However, the trust between them was still a fragile thing, easily bruised by the shadows of their former selves. The approach occurred on a Tuesday evening. The rain had returned, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the harbour into a watercolour painting of greys and blues. Draco had spent the afternoon at the local library, a Muggle institution he had initially viewed with suspicion, but had grown to respect for its quiet lack of sentient books. When he returned to the room, he looked exhilarated. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I've been researching," he said, his silver eyes bright with a spark of the intellectual hunger Hermione had always secretly admired. The wizarding world treats the Malfoy name as a brand, but the Muggle world, they have this concept of consultancy. There are historical firms, architectural restoration groups, people who value knowledge of the past without needing to know which side your grandfather fought on. The warmth in Hermione's chest was instantaneous. He wasn't just staying. He was looking for a way to be a man she could be proud of in both worlds. She moved toward him, the internal monologue of her doubt silenced for a moment. "You want to work with Muggles?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. "I want to work with anyone who doesn't look at my left forearm first," Draco replied, his tone shifting into a tense dialogue. "But more than that, Hermione, I want to build something that doesn't belong to my father. If we are to move forward, I need to know that I can provide for you, not with galleons from a vault, but with the merit of my own mind." It was a moment of profound trust. He was offering her his pride, stripped bare. But as she reached out to touch his shoulder, the seesaw tipped. The doubt returned with a sudden, icy chill. Is he doing this for me? Or is he doing this to prove he's still a master of his environment? She wondered. If he succeeds in the Muggle world, will he just build another castle? Another cage? "Is that what you think I need?" she asked, her voice cooling. "A provider. Draco, I have enough in my own accounts to keep us comfortable for years. I didn't leave the manor because we lacked merit. I left because we lacked us." The repulsion was immediate. Draco stiffened, pulling back as if she had struck him. And there it is, the great Hermione Granger, always ready to remind me that she doesn't need me for anything. God forbid I try to find a way to stand on my own 2 feet without your charity. "It's not charity," she shouted, the intensified conflict making the small room feel like a battlefield once more. "It's partnership, but you don't want a partner, Draco. You want to be the hero. You want to replace the Malfoy crown with a Muggle one, so you can feel like you've won me back. I am trying to survive," he roared, standing up and pacing the narrow floor. "I am trying to find a version of myself that isn't a ghost or a disgrace. Why is it that every time I take a step toward you, you find a way to make me feel like I'm moving backward?" The betrayal of their progress hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The cold was absolute. They stood on opposite sides of the room, 2 people who had shared a bed for 3 years and a soul-shattering kiss 48 hours ago, yet they felt like strangers. "Maybe because we're both still looking for the exit," Hermione whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You're looking for a way to be powerful again, and I'm looking for a way to be invisible so I don't get hurt. We're not walking with each other, Draco. We're just running in the same direction. The silence that followed was heavy with the gradual build-up of tension. Draco stopped pacing. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumped in a way that signaled a complete surrender of his approach. "You're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to not be the man in charge. It's the only armor I have left." He walked to the window, watching the rain blur the streetlights below. "I spent my whole life being told that if I wasn't the best, I was nothing. Being with you, it made me feel like I could be something more. But I'm terrified that if I'm just something more, it won't be enough to keep you interested." The warmth returned, but it was a sad, aching heat. Hermione walked across the room, stopping just behind him. She didn't touch him yet. She just stood in his shadow. "Draco, look at me." He turned slowly. The vulnerability in his face was devastating. The seesaw had landed on trust, but it was a heavy, grounded version of it. "I didn't fall in love with the best student in Slytherin," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her own internal monologue. "I didn't fall in love with the restorer of the Malfoy name. I fell in love with the boy who looked at me in the library when he thought I wasn't looking. The boy who was so scared and so brave all at once. I fell in love with you, the weightless you." She reached up, her hands finding the lapels of his jumper. The approach was slow, deliberate, and packed with warmth. "I don't need a provider. I don't need a hero. I just need a husband who doesn't think he has to be a king to deserve me." Draco let out a long, shuddering breath, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. The betrayal of their anger was forgotten, replaced by a raw electric trust. "I'm so tired of trying to be a king, Hermione," he whispered. "Then stop," she replied. "Just be here, with me, in this messy, damp, imperfect world." The slow burn of the moment intensified. He shifted his hands to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The tension between them was no longer about power or legacy. It was purely, viscerally about the two of them. He leaned in, his lips grazing the corner of her mouth, a teasing warmth that made her breath hitch. "I don't even know how to dry a coat properly," he murmured. "I'll teach you," she promised. "We have nothing but time." The kiss that followed was different from the one on the cliff. That had been an explosion. This was a slow, deep burn. It was a kiss of reconciliation, of two people recognizing that their seesaw would always swing, but that they could learn to ride the motion together. It tasted of forgiveness and the sharp, clean scent of the rain. When they finally broke apart, the cold of their argument had completely evaporated. The room felt larger, brighter, even in the dim light of the evening. "Tomorrow," Draco said, his thumb tracing her lower lip, "we leave Broadstairs." Hermione felt a momentary flicker of doubt, but he silenced it with a soft press of his hand. "Not for the manor," he clarified. "I've been looking at a cottage in the Lake District. It's far from the ministry, far from my mother, and it has a kitchen that requires actual effort to maintain. It's a ruin, honestly. It will take years to fix." "Without magic?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Mostly," he grinned, a flash of the old, mischievous Draco. "I think a few scouring charms for the spiders are acceptable, don't you?" The resolution of this part of their journey was clear. They were moving from disappearing to building. The conflict of the mistress was dead. The development of the partners was in full bloom. As they lay in the small bed that night, the sound of the North Sea, a rhythmic pulse in the background, Hermione felt a sense of trust she had never known at the manor. Draco's arm was draped over her, his breathing steady and calm. There were no ghosts in the room. There were no expectations. There was only the warmth of his body and the promise of a ruined cottage that they would make their own. She realized then that the psychological novel of their relationship wasn't about finding a perfect ending. It was about finding the strength to keep writing the story, even when the ink was messy. "Hermione," Draco whispered into the darkness. "Yes?" "I think I figured out the laundry detergent," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's the middle drawer, for the whites." She laughed, turning in his arms to find his lips in the dark. The approach was final. The warmth was their new standard. "You're doing great, Draco," she whispered against his mouth. "You're doing just fine." The seesaw was still, the balance was found, and as the rain continued to fall over the quiet town of Broadstairs, two people who had once been symbols of a war finally became a man and a woman in love. The resolution was absolute, the development complete, and the outcome was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. A happy ending they had built with their own 4 hands. The Lake District was a symphony of bruised purples and deep mossy greens, a landscape that felt as ancient and unyielding as the magic Hermione had tried to leave behind. But here, the air didn't smell of old parchment and stagnant tradition. It smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. The cottage Draco had found was little more than a stone shell, a skeletal remains of a life long forgotten by the fells. To anyone else, it was a disaster. To Hermione, as she stood in the center of what would one day be a kitchen, it was a blank page. The approach during their first week in the ruins was cautious. They were no longer in the vacuum of the B&B, they were in the world of action. The emotional seesaw shifted from philosophical debates to the visceral tension of physical labor. Draco, the man whose hands had once only known the weight of a wand or a crystal goblet, was now hauling rotted floorboards into the yard. "I believe," Draco panted, wiping a smudge of soot across his forehead that only served to highlight the sharp, aristocratic line of his cheekbones, "that I have found a family of field mice living in the chimney. They seemed quite offended by my presence. I think they might be purebloods. They had a very specific way of squeaking at me." The warmth flared in Hermione's chest, a bright, sparks-in-the-dark kind of feeling. She was kneeling on the dusty floor, sorting through a box of muggle tools. "Did you negotiate a treaty, or did you simply retreat?" "I offered them a piece of that dreadful gluten-free bread you insisted on buying in town. They haven't returned. I assume they've gone to find a barrister." She laughed, but as she looked at him, really looked at him, the seesaw tipped toward doubt. He was working so hard, his knuckles raw and his breathing heavy. But beneath the humor, she saw the internal monologue of a man who was still trying to prove his worth through penance. He was treating every hammer blow like an apology for the last 3 years. The betrayal of his own self-worth was the new conflict, a psychological shadow that loomed over their progress. "Draco," "Stop," she said, her voice dropping the playful tone. He froze, a heavy piece of timber in his arms. The cold of her sudden seriousness made the air between them go still. Is something wrong? Is the roof sagging? I checked the beams, I thought. The roof is fine. You are not. She stood up, brushing the dust from her jeans. You're doing it again. You're trying to build a monument to your own redemption. I didn't ask for a refurbished cottage as a sacrifice, Draco. I asked for you. The repulsion of his reaction was swift. He dropped the wood with a deafening thud, the sound echoing through the empty shell of the house. And what am I supposed to do, Hermione? Sit in the dirt and contemplate my sins? I am trying to give you a home. I am trying to show you that I can be useful, that I am not just a decorative piece of the Malfoy estate. But you're still acting like a servant to the idea of me, she countered, the intensified conflict making the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight. You haven't used magic once, even when your hands were bleeding. That's not being Muggle, Draco. That's being a martyr. And I don't want to live with a martyr. It's just another kind of cage. The tense dialogue vibrated with years of suppressed resentment. Draco's face went pale, his silver eyes flashing with a betrayal that felt deeply personal. I thought this was what you wanted, he whispered, his voice dangerously low. I thought the magic was the problem, the privilege, the ease of it all. The isolation was the problem. She stepped into his space, the approach charged with a desperate need for him to understand. The fact that we were living in a world where we didn't have to touch anything to change it. I want to touch things with you. I want to build this because we love the stone, not because you're trying to wash the blood off your name. She reached out, taking his bruised, dirty hands in hers. The warmth of the contact was a shock after the coldness of their words. She turned his palms up, tracing the blisters with her thumbs. Use your wand for the heavy lifting, Draco, she murmured, her eyes searching his. Not because it's easy, but because it's a part of who you are. I didn't fall in love with a man who pretends he isn't a wizard. I fell in love with a man who chose to be a better one. The trust that passed between them in that moment was profound. The seesaw leveled, finding a balance between their two worlds. Draco's shoulders finally dropped. He let out a long, shuddering breath, leaning his forehead against hers. The internal monologue of his shame seemed to quiet, replaced by the steady, rhythmic warmth of her presence. I'm so used to being Draco Malfoy, the problem, he admitted into the crook of her neck. I don't know how to just be the man who lives in a cottage with his wife. We'll learn, she promised, one stone at a time. The gradual build-up of tension shifted that evening. As the sun dipped behind the fells, casting long violet shadows across the valley, they sat on the porch they had just cleared. For the first time, Draco pulled his wand from his sleeve. With a fluid, graceful motion, the approach of his magic, he cast a soft, warming charm that enveloped them like a blanket. It didn't feel like the oppressive magic of the manor. It felt like a gift. Better? He asked, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. Better, she agreed. The slow burn of their intimacy was no longer a fire they were trying to put out. It was a hearth they were building. They talked late into the night, the tense dialogue replaced by a warmth of shared plans. They talked about a garden, about books that weren't cursed, about a life where Mrs. Malfoy was a name she wore like a favorite sweater, not a crown of thorns. But the seesaw had one last tilt in store. A silver doe appeared in the meadow, a Patronus. It wasn't Narcissus, it was Kingsley Shacklebolt's. The cold of the outside world, the political betrayal of their peace, had found them even here. The message was brief. Scandal is breaking. Lucius is making moves to reclaim your assets. Your absence is being framed as a kidnapping. Return or face the Wizengamot. Hermione felt the repulsion rise like bile. The world wouldn't let them go. The castle was calling its master back, and it was using a noose to do it. She looked at Draco, expecting to see the doubt, the fear of losing his wealth, the reflex to return to the safety of the name. Instead, she saw a warmth that was cold as ice. Draco didn't even stand up. He didn't reach for his coat. He simply looked at the silver doe as it faded into the mist. "Let them frame it," he said, his voice steady and devoid of the old Malfoy tremor. "Let them take the assets. I've already moved the personal accounts into a Muggle trust. There is nothing left in that house but ghosts and dust. If they want to try me for kidnapping my own heart, let them try." The trust Hermione felt in that moment was absolute. He wasn't running back. He wasn't a tourist anymore. He was the architect of his own life. The resolution of the conflict with his family was finally irrevocably moving toward its end. "Are you sure, Draco?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the internal monologue she had been carrying, the fear that he would always choose the gold. "You'll lose everything. The title, the seat on the board, the history." He turned to her, his hands framing her face, his eyes burning with a warmth that was more powerful than any spell. "I'm not losing my history, Hermione. I'm starting it. With you." He leaned in, and the kiss was a resolution in itself. It was long, deep, and tasted of the future. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found something worth more than a name. Hermione pulled him closer, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart beating a frantic, joyous rhythm against his. The emotional dynamics had shifted for the final time. The seesaw was no longer a struggle for balance. It was a shared flight. The approach was constant. The warmth was their new atmosphere. As they walked back into the shell of their cottage, the dark interior lit only by the soft glow of Draco's wand, the psychological novel of their relationship reached its penultimate chapter. They weren't coping with roles anymore. They were creating their own. "I suppose," Draco murmured against her ear as they lay down on the makeshift bed of blankets and coats, "that we should probably get used to being the Wilkins family for a while." "I think I like the sound of that," Hermione whispered, the warmth of his body drowning out the cold whispers of the ministry. The slow burn had reached its peak. In the quiet of the Lake District, away from the castles and the galas, Draco and Hermione finally found the happy ending they had earned. The conflict was resolved, the development was complete, and the outcome was a love that didn't need a monument to be real. They fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees, a pair of weightless souls finally, safely grounded. The dawn that followed the minister's message was not the grey, fearful morning Hermione had expected. Instead, the Lake District was bathed in a defiant, golden light that cut through the mountain mist. The emotional seesaw had finally come to rest, But the external world was still pressing against the glass. This was the final part of their journey, the moment where the psychological novel of their relationship faced its ultimate test, the choice between the safety of the past and the uncertainty of a shared future. Hermione was the first to wake. She watched Draco sleep, his face uncharacteristically peaceful. The warmth she felt for him was no longer a frantic, desperate thing. It was a steady flame. She knew the internal monologue that would meet him when he opened his eyes. The weight of the Ministry's threat, the loss of his heritage, the betrayal of his family's expectations. But as she watched the light hit his silver hair, she realized that they were no longer two people trying to fix a broken bridge. They were the bridge itself. When Draco finally stirred, he didn't reach for his wand. He reached for her. The approach was silent and sure. "We have to go to London, don't we?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, but devoid of the cold hesitation that had defined his first year of marriage. "We don't have to do anything, Draco," she replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We could stay here. Let them yell at the empty walls of the manor. Let them freeze the vaults. We have enough." Draco sat up, the blankets falling to his waist. The seesaw tipped toward trust. He looked around the skeletal kitchen, at the dusty tools and the patches of sky visible through the roof. "If we stay here without facing them, we're just hiding. And I'm tired of hiding, Hermione. I spent my life hiding behind a mask. I want to look Kingsley in the eye and tell him that Draco Malfoy died at the manor, and I have no intention of resurrecting him." The warmth in her chest was overwhelming. This was the resolution she had prayed for, not just that he would stay with her, but that he would stand for himself. The trip to London was a blur of tense dialogues and gradual build-up of tension. They didn't arrive as the master and mistress. They arrived in Muggle clothing, Hermione in her familiar trench coat, Draco in a dark pea coat that made him look like a poet rather than a prince. They walked into the Ministry of Magic through the visitors' entrance, hand in hand. The repulsion from the crowd was palpable. Whispers followed them through the atrium like a trail of smoke. The runaway bride, the disgraced heir, the scandal of the century. But as they stepped into the elevator, Draco didn't pull away. He squeezed her hand, his thumb rubbing circles against her knuckles. A silent approach that anchored her to the present. Kingsley Shacklebolt's office was a fortress of mahogany and quiet power. Lucius Malfoy was already there, looking like a ghost of the man he had once been, his cane gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. The betrayal in his eyes when he saw Draco was a physical thing, a cold frost that seemed to drop the temperature of the room. "Draco," Lucius hissed, his voice a dry rasp. "You have made a spectacle of this family long enough. You will sign the papers to return the assets to the trust, and you will bring this girl back to the manor where she belongs. The Ministry is prepared to drop the kidnapping charges if you act with some semblance of Malfoy dignity." The intensified conflict was a living entity in the room. Hermione felt the old doubt flare, the fear that Draco would cave under the weight of his father's voice. But Draco didn't even look at Lucius. He looked at Kingsley. "There was no kidnapping, Minister," Draco said, his voice ringing with a warmth and clarity that silenced the room. There was only a departure. I am not a hostage, and I am certainly not a Malfoy by the definition my father holds. I am here to renounce my claim to the estate. All of it. The gold, the land, the seat on the Wizengamot. It can all go to the crown or the wind. I don't care. The betrayal on Lucius's face was absolute. He looked as if he had been struck. You would throw away centuries of history for a Gryffindor mud. Careful, father, Draco interrupted, his silver eyes flashing with a cold that was sharper than any blade. That Gryffindor is my wife, and she is the only history I care about from this moment forward. The resolution of the conflict was swift and devastating. With a few signatures, Draco Malfoy effectively erased himself from the wizarding aristocracy. He didn't look at the papers as he signed them. He looked at Hermione. The internal monologue in her head was a scream of joy. He had chosen her. He had finally, truly chosen her over the castle. As they left the ministry, the seesaw swung one last time. The repulsion of the crowd was gone, replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. They were no longer symbols. They were just two people walking into the London rain. They didn't go to a hotel. They went to a small Muggle park in the heart of the city. The grass was wet, and the sky was a bruised purple, but to Hermione, it felt like a cathedral. You did it, she whispered, stopping under a large oak tree. You really did it. Draco turned to her, the tension finally draining from his face. The warmth was back, deeper and more resonant than ever before. I told you, Hermione. I'm weightless. I don't have a single galleon to my name. I don't have a title. I don't even have a roof that doesn't leak. You have me, she said, her voice trembling. That's all I ever wanted, he replied, his hands finding her waist. The slow burn of their entire journey, the running away, the seaside arguments, the ruined cottage, the ministry confrontation, culminated in this moment. The approach was final. The trust was absolute. Draco leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. I think, he murmured, that I'm ready for that happy ending you mentioned. It's not an ending, Draco, she whispered, her hands sliding up to his neck, pulling him down. It's the first chapter. The kiss that followed was the resolution of every conflict they had ever faced. It was a kiss of fire and salt, of ancient magic and new beginnings. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom. Hermione pulled him closer, her heart beating against his in a rhythm that was finally perfectly synchronized. There were no seesaws left to ride. There was only the steady, grounding warmth of their shared life. As they pulled apart, Draco didn't let her go. He looked at her with a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. One more thing, Mrs. Wilkins. Yes, Mr. Wilkins. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the platinum wedding ring she had left on the vanity in Wiltshire. He took her hand, his fingers steady, and slid it back onto her finger. This time, he whispered, it's not a shackle, it's a promise. No galas, no standards, just us. Hermione looked at the ring, then back at the man who had burned down his world to be in hers. She leaned up and kissed him again, a soft, lingering press of lips that promised a lifetime of messy kitchens and cold mornings and absolute, unwavering love. The outcome was clear. The mistress of the castle was gone, replaced by a woman who was loved for her mind, her heart, and her soul. The psychological novel of their relationship had reached its final resolution. They were no longer characters in a tragedy or a play. They were simply Hermione and Draco. As they walked out of the park, heading toward the train that would take them back to their ruin in the Lake District, the sun finally broke through the London clouds. It hit the platinum on her finger, casting a bright, defiant spark against the pavement. The development was complete. The conflict was dead. The happy ending was not a destination, but the path they were walking on, hand in hand, into a world that was entirely their own. They reached the station, the air filled with the sounds of the Muggle world. Train whistles, shouting commuters, the smell of coffee. Draco stopped her at the platform, pulling her into one last deep kiss that made the rest of the world fade into a blur of colour and sound. "Ready to go home?" he asked, his eyes shining with a light she had never seen at the manor. "Yes," Hermione smiled, leaning into his side as they boarded the train. "Let's go home." And as the train pulled away from the city, heading north toward the mountains and the stones and the life they were building from scratch, Hermione Granger Wilkins finally felt the one thing she had never felt in the castle. She felt free. The Lake District had a way of turning the most violent storms into a soft, pervasive peace. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in London, and the ruin was no longer a skeleton. It was a living, breathing home. The scent of fresh sawdust had been replaced by the aroma of rosemary and wild thyme from the small herb garden Draco had planted, with a mix of meticulous research and surprisingly effective earth-moving spells. The emotional seesaw had finally stilled, leaving behind a profound, grounded warmth. On this particular evening, the sun was sinking behind the craggy peaks of Scafell Pike, bathing their valley in a rich, liquid amber. Hermione sat on the newly finished porch, a mug of tea warming her palms, watching the silhouette of the man who had traded a throne for a hearth. The approach occurred as Draco emerged from the house, carrying 2 mismatched plates of dinner. He wasn't wearing the navy jumper today. He wore a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the faded ink of his past and the new shallow scars of honest labour on his forearms. He sat beside her, his thigh pressing against her, a constant, reassuring warmth that no longer needed to be fought for. "The roof held through the midnight gale," Draco remarked, his voice carrying a quiet pride that was entirely devoid of his old arrogance. "Not a single drip in the library. I believe the Wilkins standard of construction is officially superior to the Malfoy one. At least our house doesn't groan when the wind changes direction." The internal monologue in Hermione's head, which used to be a frantic checklist of his moods and expectations, was now a quiet song of contentment. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the trust between them so thick it felt like a physical blanket. "It's because this house wants us here," she whispered. "It doesn't have a legacy to protect. It only has us." Draco set the plates down and turned to her, his silver eyes catching the last rays of the sun. The slow burn of their romance had evolved into a steady, brilliant flame. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still made her breath hitch. "I had a letter today," he said softly, "from Andromeda. She wants to bring Teddy to see the cottage in the clouds. She said Narcissa asked after my health. Not my status, not my prospects, just if I was sleeping well." The resolution of the family conflict was a slow, healing process. but it was happening. The betrayal of the past was being paved over by the mundane, beautiful reality of their new life. "And are you?" Hermione asked, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Sleeping well?" "Better than I ever did in a 4-poster bed with silk hangings," Draco replied, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "Though I find the company in this bed is far more distracting." The approach was inevitable now. He leaned in, and the kiss was the very definition of a happy ending. It wasn't the desperate, salt-stained kiss of the Broadstairs pier, nor was it the fiery, defiant kiss of the Ministry. It was a slow, deep, and infinitely sweet homecoming. It tasted of the life they had built together, of shared tea, of whispered plans, and of a future that belonged to no one but themselves. Hermione pulled back just an inch, her hands tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck. "You don't miss it? Even a little? The crystal chandeliers? The house elves? The feeling that the world bowed when you walked into a room?" Draco looked around at their small, glowing world. The stone walls, the wildflower meadow, the flickering candles inside the window. He looked at the woman in his arms, the brightest witch who had taught him how to be a man. "I have everything I want," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, beautiful sincerity. "I don't need the world to bow, Hermione. I only need you to stay." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her heart swelling with a warmth so intense it felt like magic in its purest form. He leaned down again, his lips finding hers in a definitive, lingering seal of their vow. This was the outcome they had fought for, a love that was no longer a psychological struggle, but a sanctuary. As the stars began to pierce the velvet blue of the Cumbrian sky, they stayed on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms. The castle was 1,000 miles away, a ghost story they no longer told. In the quiet of the Lake District, the Mrs. Malfoy who couldn't cope had been replaced by a woman who was cherished, and the prince who had lost his way had finally found his home.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end. This story is more than just a fan fiction. It is a story about finding yourself. Sometimes we get lost in the roles we play for other people. We try to be perfect. We try to fit into a world that is too small for us. Hermione had to run away to remember who she really was, and Draco has to lose everything to finally find what was truly important. I believe that love is not about big castles or expensive gifts. Real love is about being seen. It is about someone holding your hand when you are messy, tired, and human. I hope this story reminded you that it is never too late to start over. You don't have to be a master or a mister, you just have to be you. Thank you for listening. Keep choosing love. Keep choosing freedom.